Hi, welcome to the lecture notes on Chapter 9, Conflict Management Processes. In this chapter, we'll focus on conflict among organizational members and specifically on conflict management styles. This approach to conflict combines organizational, interpersonal, and intrapersonal communication. In this chapter, I'll focus on the stages of organizational conflict, conflict management styles, as I said, and talk about factors that influence conflict. So, you've probably heard this, but conflict is a natural part of human life. We have conflict in each context of our life, whether it's in our families, our workplace, churches, the list is long. So you can bet that wherever humans are, conflict will be there. However, conflict doesn't have to be destructive. It can be good. Communication is the central element in conflict. So we'll look at it from a communication perspective, of course. So let's start by operationalizing or defining conflict. And as you see here, this is the definition that most communication scholars like by putting them in pool. It's the interaction of independent people who perceive opposition of goals, aims, and values, and who see the other party as potentially interfering with the realization of those goals. So let's break that down just a little bit. So when we talk about conflict, we talk about incompatible goals, we talk about interdependent behaviors, and we talk about interaction. Because for conflict to exist, all three of these factors have to be in motion. So incompatible goals, the first one. This can stem, and remember we're thinking about the organizational setting. This can stem from organizational resources, space, procedures, values, company culture, supervisor-subordinate communication, many different ways that incompatible goals can show up in organizations or between organizational relationships. Interdependent behaviors, where interdependence exists when at least two parties are intertwined or depend on one another. And finally, for conflict to exist, there has to be interaction between at least two people. So for conflict to exist, you have the three I's. Incompatible goals, whether those are perceived, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Interdependent behaviors, you depend on that other person in some way or you're intertwined. And then interaction. So let's connect this definition of conflict to the phases of organizational conflict. So this table is from your book, Table 9.1 in Chapter 9, and it reviews the 5 phases of organizational conflict. So with latent conflict, grounds for conflict exist because parties are interacting in interdependent relationships in which incompatible goals are possible. So there's just a possibility. It's latent. It's not on the surface yet. So for example, within your organization, let's say you're part of a 5-person team, there isn't any conflict yet, but the potential is there because team members are interdependent on one another, as long as they recognize that interdependence. Perceived conflict. One or more parties perceive that their situation is characterized by incompatibility and interdependence. So, for example, 2 team members may have different ideas about how to accomplish a task. So this is when perceived conflict arises, which goes right into felt conflict. So that's when we begin to think about the potential for a conflict. We brood on it a little bit. right? We get a little bit irritated and we focus on the issue and we plan how we're going to possibly get our way and what kind of strategy for conflict we're going to use. So that's felt conflict. And we also, in this phase, think about what outcomes are not acceptable for us. The fourth phase is manifest conflict. This is the phase where the felt conflict is enacted. You know, the strategies and unacceptable outcomes that we have in our mind, we're acting on them now. It's manifest, it's on the surface. We enact our conflict through communication, and the conflict may escalate and de-escalate as various strategies and types of communication are used. And then after all that is over, we have the conflict aftermath. Conflict, of course, has both long-term and short-term effects, and it can enhance or hinder the healthy functioning of an organizational relationship. So you have to think about how are you going to interact with that person after the conflict is over. Sometimes that can be awkward, and sometimes it's okay, it clears the air. So people who are competitive, are assertive, and cooperative, and willing to pursue their concerns at another person's expense. So using this style works when you don't care about the relationship, but the outcome is very important to you. So this style works better outside of your organization. If you use it inside your organization, it can really be detrimental to your work relationships. It doesn't build relationships. And you may know somebody who's very competitive at work, and a lot of times they're kind of off to themselves. So it's a interesting style. It's very assertive. Collaboration style, that's a combination of being assertive and cooperative. And assertive, if you think about it, it's not aggressive. Assertive is just standing up for what you need or for what you want without being a bully. Being assertive is, being aggressive is more about being a bully, whereas being assertive is just standing in place for what you need. So with collaboration, those who collaborate attempt to work with others to identify a solution that fully satisfies everyone's concerns. This style is the opposite of avoidance. Both sides can get what they want, and negative feelings are minimized. So collaboration works best when the long-term relationship and the outcome are important. And then finally we have compromise, which is in the middle. Where'd my cursor go? There it is. This style tries to find an expedient, mutually acceptable solution that partially, so only partially, satisfies both parties in the conflict. You do maintain some sense of assertiveness and cooperativeness, but this style is best to use when the outcome isn't crucial and you're losing time. So you really just want to make a decision and move on to more important things and are willing to give in a little to get the decision made. However, with this style of compromise, no one is really satisfied. So the interesting thing here is to think about when to use these types of styles. We all have a tendency to use one more than the others, but studying these styles and learning about when the best time is to use them could be very beneficial for you. Now let's go to the slide again. And this is a critique of conflict styles. There's more in the book, but these are the two main ones I wanted to pull out. So the grid that we just looked at, it seems very simplistic and it doesn't reflect the complex nature of conflict, but really it's hard for any theory to reflect the complex nature of conflict. And then other factors than concern for self and concern for others may play a role. The issue is important a lot of times in the conflict, so there is that to consider. And now let's look at factors that influence conflict. We've got personal factors, relational factors, and cultural factors. So personal factors. Definitely, your personality plays a small role in the conflict resolution, or it can play a large role depending on your personality. Findings on gender and conflict have been mixed. Women are generally seen as weaker and more willing to give in, and men are generally seen as more aggressive and wanting their way. These are generalizations, of course, keep in mind, but there are many findings that contradict these stereotypes that we have about gender. Personal factors also involves our perceptions of ourself, our perception of others, and the conflict itself. That affects the outcome of the conflict. People who frame conflict in terms of loss are more likely to take a risk and also more likely to reach an impasse. If you've ever been locked in an impasse with somebody in a conflict, it is not a good place to be. Usually when I hit that point, I will try and compromise in some way. Relational factors, again, the relationship between the people in the conflict has a strong impact on the conflict resolution, depending on whether it's a strong or a weak relationship or an important relationship. Power has an impact, of course, and then the positions of the individuals in the conflict. So when you're locked in conflict with a subordinate, you're using competitive style. Or perhaps if you're in a conflict with your superior, you're going to accommodate or collaborate. You're probably not going to use a competing style. And then when you're dealing with peers, so people of equal hierarchical status in your organization, you may use accommodation or avoiding. It goes back to how important is the issue to you, how important is the relationship to you. You also have cultural factors, and I don't have a slide on this one, but I just wanted to quickly mention it. Of course, the way that your culture of origin manages conflict or faces conflict has a lot to do with how you manage it as well. As Americans, we're taught to be assertive and to look out for ourselves, and so that has an impact on culture. Also, the geographical area of the U.S. that you're from has an impact on how you manage conflict. Your family of origin has an impact on how you manage conflict. How did they manage it? Did they manage it well? Did they not manage it well? Was there dysfunction? So that all of those factors together, those personal, relational, and cultural factors have an impact on how we manage conflict and what style of conflict management we choose. In addition to conflict management styles, there are also formal means of reaching resolution, such as bargaining, mediation, and arbitration. I'm not going to go into big details on those because I mostly wanted to focus on what is conflict, what factors impact it, and what type of conflict management styles exist or are in the research. So that concludes my notes about Chapter 9. I'll see you online.